Dr. Grant show. I am obscenely happy today. I have chills going down my spine with the guest that we have for today's show. Today's guest, her name is Karli Burridge, and words can't express how much I enjoy talking to her. And she's going to talk more about her background in a moment. She is the founder of gaininghealth.com. And one of the reasons why I'm excited about her talking to you is when she was younger, she saw something, a glimmer of something about the intricacies and the complexity of obesity and the journey to getting healthier, that it's about more than calorie counting, it's about more than willpower. And even though obesity medicine at that time was still in its infancy, maybe in the fetal stage at the time that she saw this, like myself, she still moved forward on that journey. She is a fellow of the Obesity Medicine Association. She has a background in psychology and exercise physiology before she completed her medical training as a PA. She has worked in primary care in metabolic surgery and bariatric surgery in the OR. She really strongly believes in a compassionate, comprehensive obesity management approach with a multidisciplinary team. And her whole entire goal with starting Gaining Health was to help other providers and other organizations who they want to start to optimize an obesity management program. And right now it's not doing her justice, but if you struggle with obesity and that journey, you want less what I lovingly refer to as Captain Obvious conversations about obesity and the journey to getting healthier, you're going to want to stay tuned to what we're about to share today. The same thing for anyone that struggles with food addiction and emotional eating, because this pertains to you as well. I am turning it over to you so you could tell people more about what led you to starting your company, Karli, and just what success have you had with people when you're working with them? Go ahead, take it away.
First of all, thank you so much, Dr. Grant, for that welcome and for inviting me to be on your show. I am so excited to be here and to meet you and get to speak with you. It's such an honor. This is a topic that I just love to talk about because unfortunately, I think there's so many misconceptions when it comes to obesity and weight and appetite. And, this passion has been brewing for me for a long time. And it started probably all the way back in high school for me. I wrote a paper on the effects of nutrition on autism. And it was because I had a cousin of mine who was struggling with behavioral issues. And I overheard my mother and my aunt talking about his food and his nutrition, and how if they cut out the artificial food colors and artificial dyes and sugar out of his diet, how that really affected his behaviors and his school performance and things like that. So that was my first inkling that, wow, nutrition must really have a very important impact. And I wanted to study psychology. I wanted to study behavior in my undergraduate studies. So I went. I'm actually from the Netherlands originally, lived mostly in Vienna, Austria. I went to an international school there. And so just randomly decided to go to the United States for college. I heard Arizona was warm. So without having ever stepped foot in Arizona, I decided to go to the University of Arizona there and study psychology. And while I really enjoyed the psychological studies, what I felt I wanted to dig deeper into was the neurobiology of psychology, right? I'm somebody, I really want to understand the why of things. I want to understand the root causes. And so I added up adding an additional major of physiology because I felt like that really explained, the biological underpinnings and all of that things on a cellular level much more so. So I graduated with those 2 degrees and I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do with them. I was in the naturopathic club. I had volunteered at the public health department. I had tried out physical therapy. I had, tried all of these different things because I knew what I really wanted to work on was, disease prevention and lifestyle, and how nutrition and psychological well-being and exercise, how all of those things come together and play such a huge role both on mental health and physical health. And I really kind of rejected the idea of going into traditional medicine because what I was seeing around me was that the way medicine was being done was more just like putting band-aids on all of these complications of things that really needed to be addressed at a much deeper level. We're really not getting to the root cause of a lot of these medical conditions. We're just putting band-aids on them and writing medications and being reactive and being more illness focused rather than wellness focused. And so for graduate school, I went to the University of Texas at Austin to study clinical exercise physiology, again, because of that connection that exercise has on both mental health and physical health. But the more I got into my studies, the more I realized that if I really wanted to work with the clinical population, with people with chronic diseases like diabetes and obesity and cancer and depression and things like that, you really had to be in a clinical role. And so that's when I decided to go to PA school. But I really wanted to, practice medicine the way that I wanted to and really get to the root cause of things. And so when I first came out, I started working in primary care because I thought that that was going to be the best place for me to be able to do that. And it should be, right? It should be. At primary care, we really should be addressing the root causes of so many of these medical conditions. But the way that primary care is set up right now, it's not really set up for that. It's these 15-minute appointments. And I was getting patients that were on multiple medications. And in those 15 minutes, you needed to order labs, review labs, refill medications, and then document all of it and do a physical exam. And it just didn't leave much time, nor did I have the right structure to be able to practice medicine really kind of the way that I had envisioned it. And so, long story short, I ended up working in bariatric surgery for a while, which also, I saw the effects that the surgery had on people in terms of helping them control their appetite. And it was really at that point that I learned more about the disease of obesity, because honestly, throughout all of my medical training and all of the other education that I had prior to that, we never learned about obesity. And at that time, obesity wasn't even recognized as a disease yet by the American Medical Association. That didn't happen until 2013. And I finished my training in 2009. So, there wasn't even that structure yet. I'd never even heard of something called obesity medicine. So, doing bariatric surgery helped me recognize that, oh my gosh, there is so much more to body weight regulation and to appetite than just choosing to eat better or to move more. There's so much more to it. And that's the part that I think a lot of people don't realize, that there's so many hormones involved. It's so complex. And that when somebody develops obesity, when somebody starts gaining weight, or if they're in an environment that's negatively impacting this whole energy regulatory system, and that system goes awry, then you get appetite that's out of proportion to what the body really needs. And then your body is just trying to catch up with that. So when people are perhaps hungrier than they should be, it's not their fault. It's all of these hormones that are going awry, and this energy regulatory system that is in the brain, in the hypothalamus in the brain, that system goes awry. And then the other side system too, which I know you're, Dr. Grant, you're so familiar with too, is that reward center of the brain, that mesolimbic part of the brain. Studies have also shown that that part of the brain is also affected by all of this. And so it just makes it so difficult for people to navigate this on their own. And then on top of that, when people lose weight, all these appetite hormones go up, and the satiety hormones that tell you that you're full go down, and your metabolism slows down. And so we wonder why it's so hard to lose weight and keep it off. And people blame themselves when it's not you, it's biology, right? So, that's when I really started learning a lot of that. And then I found out about obesity medicine, so the non-surgical treatment of obesity. And, the rest is kind of history, but that's a long-winded story to kind of tell you how I arrived at obesity medicine. And so now what I do, now that I've set up several of these programs, is I created Gaining Health to help other providers be able to put together these comprehensive, science-based, compassionate programs, because there's so many people who struggle with this and they're not getting the help that they deserve because providers don't have the education and then they don't have the know-how to put together a program.
And what I love, the key word that really jumps out at me is compassion. I have had so many conversations and have been involved in so many forums and been lucky enough to receive even some trolls. I feel so happy when I get trolls on my posts because it means I'm really barking up the right tree.
Right?
Where it's devoid of compassion for those that are struggling with obesity. And it is something that needs to be dealt with compassionately, but with some science and evidence-based approaches that are customized and tailored to someone, because everyone is entirely different. We do have those hormones going on that are at the root trying to move and shape the metabolic system. And metabolic syndrome, of course, we could go into that in that conversation as well. But there's also a psychological driver behind all that. And the last thing anyone needs is a lack of compassion when someone already knows, especially in this day and age of all this health information that's out there. So clearly, it's not that the person doesn't want to get healthier. When they look in the mirror, they see what they're seeing, even if they're trying not to see it. So the last thing on earth I have found in my experience when I chat with people is to give them anything less than compassion, but you also need solutions, which is what I love about you and what I also do as well. We're giving and crafting solutions to people at different tiers, for the physicians, for the individuals. I love that approach about you.
Yeah, I just think it's so important. And like you said, to individualize it, because every person's story is so completely different, right? And so, and therefore, the treatment approach is going to be completely different depending on the person, right? And if somebody does struggle with, and people will tell you, and I think if you are able to be empathetic and compassionate, and if you can create that safety and that trust with the patient, I think that's one of the most important things, because if you don't create that connection, it takes a lot of vulnerability and a lot of courage to open up to somebody about these things that are very private to ourselves. And unfortunately, there's so much shame surrounding weight, right? And that's just so unfortunate, because that shame causes us to block ourselves off and to put up walls and to not let people in. And, the antithesis to shame is empathy, right? And so I just think allowing people to share their story with you, and giving them that freedom and that welcoming environment that they're able to tell you their story, because their story will determine their treatment, right? And will determine what you're going to focus on. So if somebody comes to me and I ask them about, when did you first start to struggle with your weight? Was there something that happened in your life that triggered some of this for you? For some people, it'll be like, no, I'm not really sure, and they could talk about it. And for other people, they might take a step back and say, well, I've never really honestly talked to anybody about this, but they had a traumatic experience when they were a certain age, and they used food to cope with that, or to protect themselves, or maybe it was a stressful time in their family. Their parents were going through a divorce, or there was some other trauma, and that's when things triggered for them. Or others. I mean, there's, like I said, everybody's story is so different. And so then you really have to look at what some of those root causes are. And then you need to address that with the patient. So if somebody has a history of trauma, or, some type of emotional eating or food addiction, it does me no good to go and prescribe an anti-obesity medication and tell them, here's your nutrition plan. That does me no good. It doesn't do me any good, doesn't do the patient any good. And frankly, they're probably not going to come back, right?
Mhm.
So it's really about taking your time and figuring out what each individual's struggles are and what they need from you and how you can best help them be successful. And that looks so different for everybody. And I used to feel like I had to come into every appointment with like a plan in place. And what I've learned over the years is to leave the plan at the door and just to come open and just have that open environment for the patient to be able to tell me what they need today and what they would like to work on and how I can help them.
I agree with you. Because I'm trained in so many areas with the clinical hypnotherapy, the EFT tapping, which stands for emotional freedom technique, CBT line of questioning, neurolinguistic programming. When I first received all this training, on top of the 2 doctor degrees, the health psychology and the clinical holistic nutrition, I felt like I need to find a way to infuse the first appointment with all those different components, the yoga recommendations, all that fun stuff. And then I began to realize as I got deeper into it, that doesn't really serve the person any good because it makes it feel like they're drinking from a fire hose, essentially, and I still haven't helped them solve the problem. My entire goal is to serve and solve. What I found, like you, is just even having that openness, that compassion, that empathy, and being there to just simply listen to what their challenges are. I also find asking very powerful questions helps them even identify for themselves where some of these things originated. I had one lady that had a difficult time sleeping, and this took us 2 appointments to get through. And I don't charge for the first 2 appointments because really I feel that it takes about 2 1-hour appointments really for us to weed whack through and get to what the root of the problem is. I can't even formulate a adequate, comprehensive, targeted solution until we really have that time together, which is more than a 15-minute doctor's appointment is ever going to give. I don't know if that's been your observation as well, but after we weed whack through some things, she realized she was having a hard time sleeping. And I'm swinging this back over to your hormones in a moment. Sleep or lack of adequate sleep, of course, increases cortisol and the stress hormone. So if she's consistently not getting enough sleep, and I'm not saying that was entirely the only component, but it certainly was one very targeted thing that we could fix. And when I asked her, why aren't you getting enough sleep after we tried all the regular obvious things that she usually would pick, and we dug and dug and dug, and it turned out that she was afraid of falling asleep because a loved one had shared with her that people that are overweight, they die in their sleep. Now,
Yeah.
you're not going to get that in a 15-minute doctor's appointment. That's going to, but once we began to unpeel those layers, now we've got something to work with. And I educated her on cortisol, which I'm going to throw this back in your direction, the role of hormones and the ability to regulate appetite. Please educate. I can talk about it, but this is definitely your subject area. Can you definitely give people more information on that because it's so crucial?
Yeah. First of all, thank you for bringing up sleep. It's, one of the big factors that I talk about with patients. I have the MEANS model, which stands for medical factors, emotional factors, activity, nutrition, and sleep. So sleep is a big one too. So talking about hormones. So when people are sleep deprived, when they're not getting either enough hours of sleep or not good quality of sleep. So people who have undiagnosed sleep apnea, for instance, or who have sleep apnea and they're not using their CPAP machine, even though they might be getting, the 7 hours of sleep, they're not getting good quality sleep. And so what happens if you're not either getting sufficient sleep or good quality sleep is, like you said, your cortisol levels go up. That's your stress hormone. Cortisol, when you have chronically elevated cortisol, that causes your insulin to go up because cortisol makes your blood glucose go up because it's your stress hormone, it's your fight or flight. So your body mobilizes a whole bunch of glucose so that you could run or fight, right? This is our stress hormone, except we're not running or fighting anywhere. So this glucose goes up and then you need insulin to make your glucose go back down. And then unfortunately, a lot of that glucose gets stored as belly fat because that's where that fat goes. That's from the glucose that's released by the cortisol. But not only that, when your cortisol levels are chronically high, then your insulin levels are chronically high. And insulin is also the hormone that controls your fat metabolism. So when your insulin levels are high, your body's in fat storage mode. And you literally cannot break down fat, including your own fat, as a fuel source when your insulin levels are high, because insulin blocks a hormone called hormone sensitive lipase, which allows your body to take your fat and break it down and use it as a fuel source. So when your insulin levels are chronically high because you're not sleeping and your cortisol levels are chronically high, or due to other reasons, if you're over consuming processed carbohydrates, things like that. So if you're chronically elevated insulin levels, you can't burn fat as a fuel source, which makes you then reliant on glucose as a fuel source. Now, we can only store a little bit of glucose, and the way our body's designed is after we eat and our glucose levels go up, we use glucose while our insulin levels are elevated, and then our insulin levels are supposed to go back down, and then we can turn to our own fat and start using our own body fat as a fuel source between meals, overnight when we're fasting, anytime we're not eating immediately after a meal. And that's how your body weight kind of stays regulated, because you put some fat into your fat cells and then you take some fat out of your fat cells and you burn it. And, it's supposed to be this kind of exchange. Well, when your insulin levels are chronically high, you are in a one-way street to fat storage always. So I check fasting insulin levels on my patients, and they're usually always high. So that means that even if they haven't eaten anything in 12 hours, they're still can't burn their own body fat for fuel. So that makes you super hungry, because that tells your body, oh my gosh, we're in a fuel crisis, right? I need fuel. So then we crave carbohydrates, right? And then we eat carbohydrates and we temporarily feel better because our blood glucose goes back up. But then a lot of that glucose gets stored as fat. And again, so it gets you into this insulin resistance cycle where you're constantly hungry and craving carbs and fatigued. And so that's just insulin and cortisol, right?
You were explaining, you were on the tail end of explaining it and driving that point home, which I love, because I could explain it, but because you talk about it more than I do, you explain it so much more succinctly.
Yeah, it's taken me years to figure out how, there's so many of these complex phenomena, and like how to take all this science and to present it in a way that makes sense to everyday people who are not in the medical field. I feel like that's a skill I've been working on and been honing, and I think is important, because I want my patients, I want people to really understand it and to understand the science behind it. And maybe it's just me, because that's how my brain works. Like, I need to understand the science and the reasoning behind things. So when I explain it to people, I want them to understand it. Some patients really love that, and they're like, oh my gosh, this is so great, give me more. And other patients are probably like, yeah, whatever, just tell me what I need to do. But I think most people really do appreciate understanding the why behind everything.
I believe, from my observation, when it's explained well, the science is explained well, then people appreciate it. But if it's explained in a way that really makes the brain think even more and try to whack through and kind of figure out how this is relevant to the person, then it causes more problems. But I wanted you to delve into the hormone aspect of it, because I know that's something that you delve into, and like I said before, you can explain it more succinctly than I can. And everyone has different ways of explaining it, but it's something that is also, and the reason why it's so important for us to dive into this is often it's those obvious things that are right underneath our noses that we are blind to. Before we get into the psychology of stuff, before we get into the food, before we get into the exercise, sometimes there are very small changes that we can make to move the needle. It doesn't solve the entire problem, but we can begin to move the needle. And that's why I often include, even in my preliminary evaluations, how much sleep are you getting? And when I explain the reason why that's pertinent and relevant, then people say, oh my goodness, this really makes sense. And then for the people like, the lady that I was sharing with you, the clients I was talking about, once we really began to understand why she wasn't getting the sleep, because it wasn't as simple as understanding how it affects hormones. Why didn't you want to fall asleep? And this is a common thing I've been finding lately with the clients I've been talking to. That client, she had a fear of falling asleep that we would have to address the psychology behind. Another
Yeah.
client that I spoke to, she had a issue with falling asleep because things had calmed down enough for her to get things done. And the brain likes its rewards. So I stay up late until 3 a.m., but I succeeded in reading a book. I succeeded in, you know, getting certain things accomplished, especially during the pandemic. There's something called, I forgot the name of the term in this journal that I read, but retaliatory staying awake. This is clumsily stated, but it's something along those lines. I don't know if you've heard of it, but essentially you're staying awake to retaliate against all the demands that you had during that day because of the pandemic. So you're staying awake.
Right. And all the things that you didn't get to do during the day because you're taking care of everything else. Yeah. No, and sleep is huge. And it really, your story about your patient reminds me of a patient that I had with her BMI was, she had like a BMI of 100. And, you know, when we're looking at all of her factors, sleep was a big one. And she was afraid to fall asleep because she had untreated sleep apnea, but she said she couldn't afford the treatment. But she was really afraid. And in her case, it really was so severe that she could die in her sleep. So that was really tough. But that was one of the reasons why she wasn't sleeping either. She couldn't even, I mean, she couldn't lay down because she couldn't breathe. But yeah, I know it's, you know, when you really get into the stories and really start to look at what are the underlying factors, that's when you can start making headway. But I wanted to get back to the hormones too, because, you know, we had started talking about the hormones as it relates to sleep, and we talked about cortisol and insulin.
Okay.
But there's other hormones that control our appetite too, that are affected by sleep and by many other things. So our primary hunger hormone is ghrelin. So ghrelin is produced in the stomach. And when ghrelin is released, it sends a signal to the hypothalamus and our hunger control center in the brain that tells us to eat. We are hungry, right? And most people are familiar what it feels like when your ghrelin levels are elevated, right? You kind of even can feel that grumbling in your stomach sometimes, or you just feel that hungry, like, I am hungry. What is that? That's a hormone, right? That's a hormone that's talking to your brain, telling you you're hungry. So when you're sleep deprived, your ghrelin levels go up. And not only that, but studies have shown that in patients with obesity, and again, not with everybody, obesity is kind of like cancer. There's lots of different forms, right? There's not just one. But in some patients with obesity, what happens is when we eat, our ghrelin levels are supposed to drop, right? Your hunger hormones that you produce in your stomach are supposed to go down when you eat. And what they found is that some people with obesity, they don't really go down, or they don't go down very much. So even though they've had a full meal, they still have that hungry feeling. Well, gosh, I mean, anybody, that's a strong feeling. If you're hungry, you're going to seek out food. And if you're really hungry, it really doesn't matter what it is. You're going to eat the first thing that you can find, right? So ghrelin is a very powerful hormone, and that hormone gets dysregulated in some people with obesity. Another hormone that's affected by sleep deprivation is leptin. So leptin is a hormone that's produced by your fat cells. And it also talks to that part in your hypothalamus, in your hunger control center of the brain. And it tells your body about your energy stores, about your fat stores. So what it's supposed to do is when your leptin levels become elevated, it tells your brain, okay, we have enough fat stores. We can reduce our eating behaviors. We can increase the satiety signals so that we're not hungry all the time, right? Kind of like quiet down that hunger center of the brain so we're not seeking food out. Well, what happens, just like people develop insulin resistance and lots of other resistance to hormones that the brain is exposed to all the time, people can develop leptin resistance. So they're still producing the leptin in their fat cells, but that message is not getting to the brain. It's not getting to the hypothalamus. So it's not turning off those hunger signals. So people are still hungry. Their brain is still telling them that they're hungry and that they should eat. So that's leptin resistance. There are other hormones. There's lots of hormones that get released in the short term too when we eat, that signal to the brain when to stop eating. Because if you think about it, how do we decide when we start eating, when we stop eating, how long we go between meals? You know, people assumed for a long time that that was just like conscious choice, right? But I compare it to breathing. I mean, do we have some conscious control over our breathing? Yeah, sure. I mean, I could tell you, you know, hold your breath, and you can hold your breath, right? Or I can tell you to breathe faster or breathe slower. But eventually, if you're holding your breath, eventually your body gives you enough biochemical signals that tells you, I don't care what you want to do, you're going to start breathing again, or you pass out and then you start breathing because you're not consciously able to hold your breath anymore. So it's the same thing with our appetite. We do have some conscious control, but a lot of this is just driven by hormones. So other hormones that get released in the gut when we eat are hormones like GLP-1 that are produced in the small intestines. There's one called CCK, cholecystokinin, that's produced in the intestines. There's one called OXM and PYY, and then there's insulin, of course, that's produced in the pancreas. So there's all of these hormones that get released when we eat that give signals to the brain about when to stop eating and when we've had enough food to eat. And so when this whole energy regulatory system in the brain goes awry, that's when we start to really have issues with being able to control our appetite and controlling where the calories that we consume go. And that's kind of insulin's job, right? Are we burning? Are we storing? And so when all of these hormones, when this whole system breaks down, that's obesity. It's just a dysregulation of this whole system.
I am so glad that you went into that. We don't often talk enough about the role of hormones and the ability to regulate obesity. It's all part of the whole puzzle in terms of your mind, the psychology, everything. But hormones don't get their fair, shall I say, their fair shake and seat at the table. Tell us more about the programs that you have under gaininghealth.com. I know that you have programs that are available. Can you briefly tell people more about that before we go?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I, as an obesity specialist, I have started numerous obesity management programs from the ground up. And that's simply because I've had to move to several different states because of my husband's job, and just different opportunities presented themselves where I've built now several of these programs from the ground up. And I'm very involved with obesity education on a national and international level. But what I was finding was that a lot of people, even once they received the education on obesity management, they were still struggling with putting together the pieces of building a comprehensive obesity treatment program for their patients, how to really apply the knowledge that they have learned. And it takes a lot of time to put together all the components of a comprehensive, compassionate obesity program. So, what I did is I used my experience of developing these programs, and I created Gaining Health. And I wrote a book on how to develop and manage an obesity management program. So it goes through everything of writing your business plan to structuring your initial visits, your follow-up visits, and then also, very importantly, the communication side, using cognitive behavioral therapy, motivational interviewing, positive psychology, all of these things. How can we use this when we're communicating with our patients? Because honestly, at the end of the day, I think that's where the success of a program lies. You can have a perfectly structured program, but if you're not communicating in the right way with your patients and you're not approaching it the right way, you're not going to be successful and your patients are not going to be successful. So I wrote the book on that. And then I also created templates and forms that are fully editable so that people don't have to take the time to create all of this from scratch on their own. And then I also created a patient education manual where we take all of the science and all of the things that we want to talk to our patients about in comprehensive, compassionate obesity management, and put together these patient education materials so that providers can use that to help guide their patients and say, for this week, why don't you read, part 2 of section 1, on this topic, so that it really helps educate the patients in a way that's in lay language to help understand all of the science behind all of this, and also to put together, really treatments that are very actionable and really help patients explain why you might use a certain treatment. And the book, the Patient Education Guide, is written as a little bit of a, create your own adventure, because as we talked about at the beginning, there's no two people that have the same journey. So for somebody, they may need to start at the last chapter, or they may need to start on the chapter on sleep or on emotional health before they get to the part on nutrition or physical activity or anything like that. So what I'm doing is I'm just trying to create resources to help providers, because my goal is that comprehensive science-based compassionate obesity medicine is available to anybody who
Mm.
wants to seek it out. And in order for that to happen, it needs to be in primary care, it needs to be everywhere. And so I want to help facilitate that and make that happen because our patients, people deserve it. They deserve this type of care. And I think we need it. What we're doing right now is not sustainable.
I agree with you. It's definitely not sustainable. I like the create your own journey aspect of it because unless we take the ideology and the approach that to fully and sustainably address embracing healthier behaviors such as obesity, we need to release the calories in, calories out module and thought and really look at obesity as something that requires a multi-dimensional approach. Once we embrace that, our opportunity to address it compassionately and with empathy opens up exponentially, and it benefits everyone. It benefits the person that's struggling and wants to get empowered from it. It benefits the health providers. It benefits everyone in terms of even the quality of life. People will be able to, for example, the one lady I spoke to, she wanted to just simply be able to have enough energy to play with her grandkids. There's just so many benefits, both medically, psychologically, quality of life, nutritionally, that there's not even enough pages and not enough video time to, to discuss it. But where can people, if they want to talk to you more, where can they find you?
Yeah, you can reach out to me via my website, gaininghealth.com. You can find me on LinkedIn, Karli Burridge. I'm on Facebook, so you can find me under Karli Burridge, and then also at My Gaining Health on Facebook. And you can always email me too at karli@gaininghealth.com.
Okay. All right, guys. I love her. And there's not enough time for us to talk about how much I love her. We share similar backgrounds in terms of something that we saw when this industry was in its infancy. And what I love about her is she decided to do something about it. A lot of us can just complain and say that there are no resources out there, but I lost my mother to food addiction, emotional eating, and obesity. And when I lost her in 2016, she was so large that we were afraid we weren't going to be able to have the funeral. And they almost dropped her at the burial site twice. And I was planning at that time to return back to academia. I've been working in academia for 20 years. My mother suffered from sleep apnea. So, Karli, when you're talking about sleep apnea, we didn't know for the longest time she was undiagnosed. But when she finally went in for the test, whatever the highest number was for the amount of times to stop breathing at night, my mother hit that number. So they gave her that CPAP machine and all that stuff. So it's something that this knowledge is so important because we often have issues that are right underneath our noses and we don't even know it. And this is one of the reasons why I started the show. Sometimes people don't have the financial resources, but if they can just get a tip or some advice and that can point them in the right direction through guests like yourself, and physicians can get information to point them in the right direction, we can begin to heal this rift and shorten the gap from where people are to where they want to be. And everyone can come out on top being happier and really fulfilling their full potential.
Yeah. And I think at the end of the day, that's what it's about, right? You want people to be able to live the life that they want to live. And when people ask me about, well, what should my weight be? What's my goal weight? I say, whatever weight you can be at where you can be happy and do the things that you want to do in your life, that is your goal weight. And so I think
Yes.
you're so right with that. And I'm so glad that you do what you do. And it's unfortunate that it was the passing of your mother and the struggles that she had that led you to this, but I know you're helping so many people with, diving into this and making a difference.
Yes, thank you. That is my goal. And that's one of the reasons why I love having guests on like yourself, because you also see that there's a need and you bravely moved forward on creating a solution. So everyone, I cannot recommend her enough. Her name, once again, is Karli Burridge. Her website is gaininghealth.com. She has several products that are available. Check it out. See if it's a perfect alignment for something that you need. You don't have to go at this alone. You're not alone. And for past episodes, current episodes, and future episodes of the Dr. Grant Show, I can be found on edibleaddiction.com. Also, the products and the services that we have are housed under edibleaddiction.com as well. Everyone, thank you so much for watching the show. Make sure to share this and like this information and share it with someone that you know might really need to hear this information. Everyone, thank you so much for watching. Until next time.